Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition costs. One can also audit such a course at a much less cost. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. Today's lecture event is part of the 13th Annual Kościuszko Chair Conference. This conference is sponsored by the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies and the Center for Intermarium Studies. This evening, we'll be hearing from Dr. Paul Kengor. Dr. Kengor is a professor of political science at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and a New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books. He is a senior director and chief academic fellow at the Institute for Faith and Freedom and former visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His articles have appeared in publications from the Washington Post and USA Today to the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. He is a longtime columnist and senior editor for the American Spectator. Dr. Kengor is an internationally recognized authority on, among other topics, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, communism, socialism, and conservatism. Dr. Kengor, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Good to be with you. And it's an honor to be part of this conference. I'd like to thank my friend Marek and also John Lenchowski. So it's good to be with you all. And IWP is one of my favorite places. I recommend it to my Grove City College students all the time. So not just saying that to be nice, that's completely sincere. So thank you for the chance to record this, pre-record this. So you and Katie offered me several different dates that I could do pre-record. And to confess here, as a good Catholic boy, I picked October 22nd because it is the feast day of Saint John Paul II. And that's when we are pre-recording. We are pre-recording on October 22nd, 2020. So I'm allowed to speak here for about 30 to 40 minutes. I have some talking points. I could go off the top of my head, but I think it's better if I script myself a little bit. I have a little bit of a presentation to follow here. And in doing this, that means I got to put on my glasses, which will cause a glare on the screen. But once you turn 50, this is what happens. You wear glasses. And so that'll probably won't look all that great visually, but nonetheless, that's where we go, what we're going to do. So I'll try to keep them off if I can, but I'll often have to put them on. So talking here about Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and this extraordinary partnership that helped change the world, that won the Cold War, that changed history. And I've studied this quite a bit. I've written on this quite a bit. In fact, it was, I think so, right? I spoke at IWP in 2017 on my book, A Pope and a President, on John Paul II, Ronald Reagan. And that was, yeah, that would have been, that was when my book came out at that point. My book came out in May 2017. So I think I spoke around that summer. So this is a topic I've studied quite a bit. And I should add here too that was followed up by Robert Orlando, the filmmaker, and I did a book together called The Divine Plan, which was based on a film by the same name. And among the 14 people that Rob Orlando interviewed for that were Marek, his wife Monica, and two excellent scholars in their own right. Monica's doing wonderful work on John Paul II. The literary aspect, the poetry aspect, his acting, his theatrical works. And also included in that was Richard V. Allen. We interviewed H.W. Brands, Doug Brinkley, Bishop Robert Barron, Cardinal Dolan, Craig Shirley, just a really impressive, George Weigel, an impressive group. So enough of that. All right. So I'll start my presentation here. October 16th, 1978. On that date, the conclave met, the College of Cardinals, and got together, and they had to pick a new pope. So it was the previous pope, who went by John Paul. Turns out he would be John Paul I, although of course they didn't call him John Paul I yet. He had been in the papacy for only 33 days, of all things. Very unexpected death. They met and they chose the 264th heir to the chair of St. Peter. And they chose the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. If you can imagine that, that's like twice the life of the United States, right? That's how long there had been Italian popes, 455 years. So of all things, they picked the first Slavic pope ever and the first Polish pope ever. They plucked him out of the middle of the heart of the Soviet communist bloc, the one country in the entire Soviet empire where the war on religion, as Mikhail Gorbachev would later rightly describe it, had completely failed. So, of all places, the College of Cardinals goes there to pick the next pope. Karol Wojtyła, Archbishop of Krakow, cardinal from Krakow. The reaction to this, people were stunned everywhere. People were stunned. Christoph Meisner, who talked about watching this on Polish television, and he said, we awaited confirmation by evening news. At last, an announcer came on with a very sad face, announced that a new pope had been elected, and it was Karol Wojtyła, right? Kind of, ho hum, no big deal. Then on to the potato crop, the harvest, whatever else, right? No big deal. But of course, this was a big deal. And among the people who were shocked by this, stunned by this, probably the three most remarkable reactions would have been Ronald Reagan, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, he had spearheaded the anti-religion department directorate of the KGB for years, and he was absolutely floored by this. In fact, he telephoned the KGB chief in Warsaw, and he asked him, how could you possibly allow the election of a citizen of a socialist country as pope? And to which the guy on the other end was like, well, I think you should direct your questions here to Rome, sir. I can't explain that, right? You should maybe be asking them. The John Paul II, as he would become known, that's the name that he picked to honor his predecessor, John Paul I, who had picked that name from the two previous popes. St. John the 23rd wasn't a saint yet, and also wasn't a saint yet, Paul VI. So it had been John the 23rd, and then Paul VI, and then John Paul I, and then following that, John Paul II, who wouldn't be there a mere 33 days. He'd be there 27 years altogether. He gave his first homily on October 22nd, 1978. So 42 days, 42 years from the time that I'm recording this right now. And again, will become the feast day of St. John Paul II once he was canonized. And he said there in those famous lines from Scripture, those famous three words from the New Testament, said by Jesus many times, said by the angel Gabriel to Mary in the Annunciation, be not afraid. Be not afraid. Open the doors to Christ, open them wide, open the borders of states, economic and political systems, the vast domains of culture. Now, that said, Moscow was very afraid. They were very worried about this. And they were especially worried when Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, chose when they said, hey, where would you like to go first? Your first foreign trip. If you had a choice, where would you like to go first? And he said, Poland. Of course, Poland, my Polish homeland. And his handlers said, well, I don't know. I mean, are you sure? Be a little provocative here. I'm sure the Polish communist government doesn't want this. I'm sure Moscow definitely doesn't want this. And Brezhnev intervened too and called Garrick and said, you need to veto this. You need to tell him no. And he said, how can I do that? My country is Poland. My people are Polish. It's Catholic. The Pope is Polish. He's from Poland. How can I say no to him? And Brezhnev told him, said, you better not regret it. Slammed down the phone. Well, he would regret it because John Paul II went there June 2nd through 11th, 1979, attracted massive crowds of people, thousands upon thousands, in some cases, millions. I mean, millions from all around Poland. Mark could talk about this. Monica could talk about this. Showed up to see the man. Probably a majority of Poles actually saw him during those 9 days, June 2nd through 11th, 1979. And I love this about John Paul II, as I do about Ronald Reagan. His courage, his boldness, his appreciation. He and Reagan both had been actors. They understood the power of the spoken word. They knew how important communications was. They knew how important the stage was. And so for his stage in Poland, he picks Warsaw's Victory Square. Victory Square. Imagine the symbolism of that. And for his first homily there, he said exactly what the communists did not want him to say. Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man in any part of the globe. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland. And then this, there can be no just Europe without the independence of Poland marked on its map. There can be no just Europe without the independence of Poland marked on its map. And that was heard in Moscow. The New York Times reacted to this with a New York Times editorial, typical snooty Times editorial, June 5th, 1979. As much as the visit of John Paul II to Poland might reinvigorate and re-inspire the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, it does not threaten the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe. Yeah, right. Tell that to the Soviets. Tell that to the Soviets. In fact, tell that to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan I've talked to Dick Allen, Richard V. Allen. Dick is still around. And he was Reagan's first national security advisor, all of 1981. Prior to Bill Clark coming in 1982, John Lenchowski worked for that National Security Council. And it was Dick Allen was Ronald Reagan's foreign policy advisor late 1970s, from about 1977 on through 78, 79, 80. So before he was president, they were sitting together in California, Reagan's office in California, talking about foreign policy. They decided to take a break, turn on the evening news, June 1979, and they turned on the evening news and they saw footage of John Paul II's return to his Polish homeland. And Allen, who talked about this in our Divine Plan film, said, I looked over at Reagan and there was a tear in his eye. He was clearly moved. And he looked at this outpouring of emotion for the Polish Pope. And he said, Dick, that's it. The Pope is the key. The Pope is the key. The Pope is the key. We've got to find a way to get elected. Not easy to do. We've got to reach out to this new Polish Pope in the Vatican and make them an ally. Make them an ally. That was Reagan's goal. So Reagan said, well, I got to get elected. This for Reagan is a game changer. Reagan had stood in front of the Berlin Wall in November 1978. Now, here was a moment that no one saw other than Dick Allen, Peter Hannaford, and their wives. And Nancy Reagan was there as well. So Nancy, Ronald Reagan, the Allens, the Hannafords, 6 of them. And Reagan stood there in front of the Berlin Wall, November 1978. Allen has talked about this. Hannaford has talked about this. And Reagan looked at the wall and said, we've got to find a way to knock this thing down. We've got to find a way to knock this thing down. And by the way, this was the complete opposite of what Jimmy Carter had been thinking, or Gerald Ford, or Richard Nixon. Complete opposite. They weren't thinking about knocking down the Berlin Wall. And besides that, they didn't think it was possible. Reagan believed it was possible, it was feasible, and all of a sudden, with a Polish Pope, this was, he believed, a vehicle to help make it happen. This was a game changer in the Cold War. That June 1979 trip was also a game changer for the Soviets. They met, the Soviet, they meaning the Soviet Central Committee, November 13th, 1979. 9 comrades from the Central Committee, by the way, one of which, in addition to people like Suslov, Kirilenko, Chernenko, Ponomarev, was Mikhail Gorbachev. He was there as well. And they tried to decide what to do about this menace in the Vatican, this Polish Pope, November 13th, 1979. What are we going to do about this? Well, they issued this chilling edict, quote, use all possibilities available to the Soviet Union to prevent the new course of policies initiated by the Polish Pope. Let me repeat that. Use all possibilities available to the Soviet Union. That's a scary thought for a nation that was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. If necessary, with additional measures beyond disinformation, that's desinformatia, and discreditation. John Kohler, who was an AP reporter and a good Cold War historian as well, he was the first to procure this document, which he got from the Italian Secret Service agency SISDE, SISDE. And Kohler said that in layman's terms, this was an order for assassination, foreshadowed by the need to, quote, get physically close, unquote, with the Pope. And, that was not to kiss his ring. And it says, Kohler noted that at the bottom of the document, at the end of the text, was a note from Italy's security service. And Kohler said, SISDA says, document found in Moscow points to plan for the physical elimination of JP2. Physical elimination of JP2. I mean, they wouldn't do that, would they? They wouldn't do that. Next, November 4th, 1980, 1 year later, it gets even worse for Moscow. Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter, the cowboy, the crusader, as the Soviets were calling him. Beat Carter by 10 points, 51 to 41%. This is an incumbent. Reagan won 44 out of 50 states, won the Electoral College 489 to 49. Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981. Immediately, the Soviets feared a Reagan-JP2 alliance. And I'm always amazed by this. Well, no, I'm not amazed. I should never be amazed by anything the Soviets or the communists do. But in the Soviet press, I found this in going back through Soviet archives and writing A Pope and a President. They referred to John Paul II as a malicious, lowly, perfidious, and backward toady of American militarists, seeking to undermine communism with his overseas accomplices and his new boss in the White House. His new boss in the White House, Reagan, John Paul II's new boss, Reagan. That's how these guys thought. As Joe Stalin said, if death solves all problems, right? No man, no problem. If maybe this man could just be dead. Well, they got close to having their wish with both men. March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan walking outside the Washington Hilton after speaking to the AFL-CIO. Reagan goes outside, and waiting outside for him is what Reagan charitably called a confused young man by the name of John Hinckley, who was trying to get the attention of actress Jodie Foster. And he did. He certainly got her attention, put a bullet in the president, as well as several others around him, Press Secretary Jim Brady, a couple of Secret Service people, Park Police, some Washington, D.C. police officer. Reagan was immediately rushed to George Washington University Hospital, where he very nearly bled to death, required massive blood transfusions. And but he made it. He made it. You move that bullet a few centimeters over, a little closer to the heart, the main aortal valve, and Ronald Reagan would not have made it to George Washington University Hospital, at least not alive. He got out of the car, walked out, boom, fell right down, took him straight to the emergency room. Fast forward only 6 weeks. So from May 30th, 1981 to May 13th, 1981, from Washington, D.C., outside the Washington Hilton, to Rome, St. Peter's Square. And there it was another confused young man, although I don't know how confused he was. He knew exactly what he was hired to do, named Mahmoud Ali Asha, A-G-C-A, like Asha. And he was a Muslim Turk carrying a 9mm semi-automatic Browning concealed inside his jacket. He had been dropped off there early in the morning, had mulled around all day long, waiting for John Paul II to appear as planned for his audience in St. Peter's Square. John Paul II, white Fiat Pope Mobile, eventually gets up closer to Asha. Asha lifts his gun in the air about 5:15. Actually, George Weigel in Witness to Hope, Weigel, that being the definitive biography of John Paul II, says the time on the clock was 5:13 p.m., which would have matched the time on the calendar, the date on the calendar, 5:13, May 13th, 1981. Feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, which is remarkable because John Paul II was the totus tuus priest or totus tuus pope, totally yours to Mary, that consecrated his papacy to Mary. When he lost his mother as a young man, his father took him to Czestochowa to the Black Madonna and said, "Here now is your mother. Mary is your mother." And that was the first May 13th, 1917 was the first of the several Marian apparitions in Fatima, where, among other things, she disclosed 3 different secrets. All of this ended in the miracle of the sun, October 13th, 1981. And a third of these secrets, which John Paul II did not read until 2 months after this event, in July 18th, 1981, when recovering in Gemelli Clinic, would call for the apparent attempted assassination of the bishop in white. And the only bishop that wears white in the Catholic Church is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So 5:13 p.m., 5:13 on the calendar, and John Paul II comes around. Mahmoud Ali Asha lifts his pistol, squeezes a trigger. 4 shots are fired, 2 of which hit the Pope, 1 in the left hand and another in the abdomen. And as John Paul II would put it, one hand fired the bullet, another hand guided the bullet. So he believed that he was protected by a divine hand, a maternal hand, a divine hand of some sort. He's immediately rushed to the hospital, to Gemelli Clinic, or Gemelli Hospital, and he very nearly bled to death. He probably should have bled to death. Just like Ronald Reagan, if the bullet that struck him in the abdomen was over just a little bit more, closer to the main abdominal artery, he almost certainly would have bled to death. Required mass transfusions. His body rejected the first transfusion. Father Jivich, his close aide, who was there on hand, gave him the anointing of the sick, gave him last rites. They rejected the first transfusion. People there, staff had to donate blood to give him another transfusion. His blood pressure plummeted to 70 over whatever, probably 70 over 40, 50. He underwent 5.5 hours of emergency surgery. He required 6 pints of blood. Ronald Reagan needed 8 pints of blood. They both could have easily bled to death. Asha tried to escape, but he was tackled by a nun named Sister Letizia from the Bergamo region of Italy. And he's lucky that the nun tackled him and pinned him down with a couple of people there to help, because his Soviet pals, his Bulgarian buddies, all working for the KGB, they called more on this in a minute, but they were supposed to escape him out of there, but the plan was that they were going to put a bullet in Asha as well. I mean, they weren't gonna. Did you think we were gonna let you live, comrade? No, that's not how the Soviets do things. A friend of mine said, just like the mafia. Now, don't insult the mafia by comparing them to the communists. That's not fair to the mafia. So Ronald Reagan was at 4 days after this. Ronald Reagan spoke publicly 6 weeks after surviving his own assassination attempt at Notre Dame, of all things. University of Notre Dame University, University of Our Lady. That's what Notre Dame means. Reagan spoke at commencement. That had been pre-decided in advance, maybe preordained, perhaps. And Ronald Reagan there warned in that talk. He said that he said his prayers were with John Paul II. And just as John Paul II in the previous year's encyclical on mercy and justice had warned of, quote, certain economic theories that use the rhetoric of class struggle to justify injustice. The neighbor is sometimes destroyed, killed, killed. And to me, I think that might have been the first public indicator of what Ronald Reagan was thinking. It's also what Bill Casey at the CIA was thinking as well. And Owen, kudos to you. I know that Bill Casey's daughter and son-in-law are very close to IWP, and really absolutely the two front men, the two most important figures in connecting between Ronald Reagan and Rome, Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, would have been Bill Clark and Bill Casey, two Irish Catholics, and really above all, Bill Casey, more important than anybody else. Flew to Rome often in windowless C-141 black jet and met with the Pope. We don't know how many times. He kept us very, very close to the vest. But Casey, too, was wondering, what were the Soviets up to? Could the Soviets possibly had a hand in this shooting of the Pope? Ronald Reagan and John Paul II got together at the Vatican in June 7th, 1982. They had wanted to get together since the start of Reagan's presidency. Reagan wanted to get together with him since June 1979, but again, had to get elected first. They met at the Vatican June 7th, 1982, one-on-one in the library, and for about 50 minutes, about an hour altogether. And they said to one another that they believed that God had spared their lives for a special purpose, which was to take down and defeat the Soviet Empire, atheistic Soviet communism. So imagine this non-Polish president, this non-Catholic president, saying to the Polish Pope, hope remains in Poland, in your country. We working together can keep it alive, which they would do through directives like NSDD 32, which John Lanchowski knows all about. That was one of about 100 NSDD's formal policy directives done under Bill Clark's tutelage in the NSC through 1982 and 1983, which called for bringing political pluralism, of all things, to Eastern Europe. So this would be, as Tom Reed and others pointed, this was NSDD 32, NSDD 75 under Richard Pipes, NSDD 66, a number of others. These were all about rolling back Soviet communism. So not just containing the Soviet Empire, but liberating the people of Eastern Europe. That's what Reagan wanted to do. It's what John Paul II wanted to do. They wanted to do it peacefully, and they did it through an extraordinary number of means. My book, The Crusader, goes through a dozen or so, if not 24 different elements where they attempted to do this. And kudos here as well to Ken de Graffenried of IWP, of Roger Robinson, who ran the economic warfare portfolio for the Reagan administration on things like the pipeline, energy reserves. The Reagan administration looked for 100 different ways to try to undermine Soviet communism and did it. Reagan, John Paul II they saw Poland as the key. Poland was the key. Carl Bernstein, in a piece for Time magazine 10 years later, the cover, 1992, was called Holy Alliance, was actually the name of the cover of that issue of Time magazine. He quoted a cardinal, probably Pio Laghi at that point, although it could have been Casaroli. And the cardinal said, nobody believed the collapse of communism would happen this fast or in this timetable. But in their first meeting together, so it had been at the Vatican, June 7th, 1982, the Holy Father and the President committed themselves and the institutions of the Church and America to such a goal. From that day, the focus was to bring it about. They consented to a clandestine campaign to, quote, hasten the dissolution of the communist empire, free all of Eastern Europe, and they believed that Poland, a free Poland, could be a dagger to the heart of the Soviet Empire. So start with Poland as the first domino to knock over, and the others would follow. domino, dagger, wedge in the block, the communist block, BLOC, like a block of wood, BLOK, take the wedge, pound it in there, crack it from top to bottom. That's what Poland could do. Poland had that potential. Reagan and John Paul II would meet 5 times. In Rome, June 1982, in Fairbanks, Alaska, May of 1984. They would meet at the Vatican again in June 1987. They would meet in Miami, September 1987. People often say, have asked me about the cover of my book. They're like, "That's an amazing picture. Is that photo op?" And I said, "No. Is that Photoshop?" No, it's from the two of them meeting together in Miami in September 1987. I love that picture. In fact, Nancy Reagan said it's her favorite picture of the two of them. Nancy met with John Paul II 7 times, more even than her husband did. She said, "I loved him. He was my favorite leader. He was my favorite person that Ronnie met with." But she said of that picture of Ronald Reagan and John Paul II in Miami, September 1987. She said, "Yeah, Ronnie is very deliberately making a point. You can see him talking with his hands, and the Pope is just listening very pensively." I think it's a great picture that captures them together. They met at Castel Gandolfo as well in September 1990. I'll hit this one point, and then I got to move on. I'm looking at the clock. I'm not supposed to go. I'm supposed to do 30 to 40 minutes, so I have maybe 10. What I focused on at length in the book, A Pope and a President, was the fact that Bill Casey's CIA looked into whether or not the Soviets were behind the hit on the Pope. And Casey had two women working for him, in particular 2 analysts, both fairly young, I think one in her 30s, other in her 40s, who I'll say it now because he's now passed, God rest his soul, Herb Meyer. Herb Meyer is the secret source in my book, Pope and a President. And he could not go on the record, but Herb Meyer told me that Herb Meyer saw the report. He saw the report that it was done. And he said that report concluded that the Russians did it. And I'm looking at a quote from Herb that I think I shared at IWP when I talked about this in 2017. And I didn't tell you who said it then, but I'll tell you now, it was Herb. He said, quote, "That was the single most secret document I've ever seen. About 30 pages, eyes only, really, really tight. Only 1 or 2 copies. So classified that they practically took the eyeballs out of the corpses of the secretary who typed it and of those who read it." That's classic Herb, if you knew Herb. "That document has never come out. That document has the answer." Herb said, Casey authorized 2 women, really bright, fabulous. They did great work. They ran circles around the CIA establishment. And he said it was their conclusion and that report's conclusion that the Kremlin ordered the hit on John Paul II. And they did it not through the KGB. Herb told me, again, Herb is anonymous in my book. Herb told me that was the issue. Everybody was pinging their KGB sources and they couldn't find out. He said the KGB didn't do it. Yes, Yuri Andropov was the head of the KGB and he knew about it. He gave the green light. He authorized it. But the GRU did it. The GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, ordered the hit. That's why people were failing to find out through the KGB. KGB gave it the go-ahead, but the GRU did it. That's what Herb said. Herb said that document, and I know that Owen is, I think, still working on this, maybe, that document has not been declassified. It has not been fully released through Langley. John Paul II was briefed on this by, once again, by Bill Casey. And when Casey told him about what the United States had concluded, what his CIA had concluded about the Soviet role, he was not surprised. He knew because he had the 3rd secret of Fatima. That told him that the communists were behind it. 1989 came the collapse of communism, which was the Berlin Wall, of course, fell in November 1989. But as this group will appreciate, and it's great to say this for this particular conference, the KC conference, which I'll abbreviate because my Polish is horrific. Even though Kengor is partly Polish, I think it's a Polish name. Forgive me, Mark, for not knowing the Kengor family can't figure it out. My mom's side is 100% Italian. They can trace all that stuff back to Calabria, but my dad's side, it's not real clear. But much more important than the Berlin Wall in November 1989, or what led to the breach of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, were the June 4th, 1989 elections that were held in Poland, where the communists lost every single contested seat that was held in the legislature, which is why, ladies and gentlemen, communists don't hold elections, because when they do, communists lose. That's the way it is. That's why Castro's Cuba, despite what American leftists say about the wonderful healthcare and free education down there, I'll tell you, it's amazing. All right. If it was so amazing, they'd hold elections and they let the people vote in the Castros or vote in the communists. They don't. Castro promised free and fair elections in 1959, and it's been over 60 years. We're still waiting. So with that, Berlin Wall fell November 9th, 1989. And the Soviet Union would disintegrate. It would no longer be called the Soviet Union by the end of 1991. So the Vatican, Ronald Reagan and John Paul II met together what would turn out to be one last time. They met at Castel Gandolfo in September 1990. It was during Reagan's tour of Eastern Europe, where Reagan went to the Berlin Wall with a little hammer, hit the wall, took off a chunk to bring home. That meeting between Reagan and John Paul II, by the way, imagine if this was, I'm sorry about the partisan comment. If this was some liberal Democrat president who had won the Cold War and was meeting with the Pope, I mean, there'd be a ticker tape parade. All of the media would be there celebrating this great moment. The only English-speaking newspaper, or the only one I could find in the United States that even covered it, was USA Today, with a 3-sentence blurb. The blurb said, former President Ronald Reagan and his wife, Nancy, finished up their European tour by visiting John Paul II at the Papal Summer Palace outside Rome. The Pope ended the 30-minute meeting with the words, God bless America. The Vatican said no other details were released. That was it. I asked Nancy Reagan about it a number of times. In fact, when I went back and putting the book together and going through my notes, I must have asked her 5 or 6 times by email, through Joanne Drake, her wonderful aide. And she would always answer. She would always say, I know, I wish I could give you more about this. Did we talk about the end of the Cold War and the fall of Berlin Wall? Yeah, yes, we did. We did. But other than that, I can't remember any specifics, other than to say that it was such a warm and wonderful meeting. So we just loved the Pope. We loved him. We just loved him. And if only the two of them knew that it was the last time that they would spend together, that they would see one another. Ronald Reagan died June 5th, 2004, at the age of 93. So at that point, the longest living former president. And John Paul II died a year later on April 2nd, 2005. And at 21:37 on the clock, 9:37 p.m. Rome time. All that adds up to 13. The number 13 in the life of John Paul II in Fatima. 21:37 on the clock and 4/2/2005 on the date. So he passed. He passed. Later on, I'll conclude with these final points. June 27, 2011, at St. Mary's Basilica in Krakow, a special Thanksgiving Mass for who was then Blessed John Paul II. He was not canonized yet. And for the life of President Ronald Reagan. Officiating was Cardinal Zivich, who had been the priest who was there that caught in his arms a sagging, shot John Paul II, Pope, on May 13th, 1981. He officiated. And he said there, this world is a battlefield of good and evil, truth and falsehood. Each of us faces a choice. Today, we recall two great men who stood before this very choice, and their decision influenced the course of history and shaped the world in which we live. Shape the world in which we live. They did. They answered that call. They chose the side of good. They came together on that battlefield. To quote John Paul II, they were unafraid. They spoke truth. They courageously spoke to what both considered evil, evil empire, and an evil ideology. They stood up to it powerfully, poignantly. Both men even took bullets. They even took bullets, of all things. They nearly died for their missions and what they believed. And then they came together and they worked together as partners to truly change the world. And they rewrote, with a very happy ending, the end of the 20th century. So that's it for me. Thank you all very much. John, Marek, and Hannah, thank you for hosting me. And thanks for this chance to talk to your group. God bless. Take care.